Yesterday morning I ironed my only decent shirt. The fabric's thinner now, the collar a little frayed, but I pressed it anyway. Slow, careful strokes. It's strange, isn't it? How a man can spend half his life fixing other people's engines but still struggle to make a shirt look respectable. I don't wear it for weddings or church anymore. These days, I save it for court. Not because I've been in trouble not lately, but because they needed me to testify for an old friend's case. It was supposed to be routine. A land boundary, a few signatures, a few polite lies, nothing worth remembering. But the thing about small-town courthouses is they're like time capsules. You walk through those glass doors, and suddenly it's 20, 30 years ago again. The same tile floors, same brass handles, same smell of wood polish and paper dust. And that smell, Lord, it hit me like a memory I didn't ask for. Back when I used to sweep these very halls after hours, earning a few extra bucks, fixing light fixtures for the county. Back when I thought I could outwork my mistakes. I heard my boots echo down the corridor, each step slower than the last. The tick of my watch felt louder than it had in years, like it was reminding me there was still time. Or maybe not. I told myself it was just another morning. Just a testimony. In and out, shake a few hands. Tell the truth as best I could. But deep down, I think I knew the past was waiting on the other side of that door, quiet, patient, like a man holding his breath underwater. When I reached for the handle, I caught my reflection in the brass. For a second, I didn't recognize myself. The gray in my beard, the lines by my eyes, they looked like someone else's face. But the eyes, they hadn't changed. They were still the same eyes that watched a man go under that river a lifetime ago. I brushed off the thought, straightened my shirt, and pushed through the door. Inside, the courtroom looked smaller than I remembered. Rows of benches half empty. Lawyers whispering over stacks of paper. Fluorescent lights humming like tired bees. The air felt cold, the kind of cold that doesn't come from temperature, it comes from silence. Then the bailiff said it, "All rise." And he walked in, Judge Henry Whitmore. Older, heavier around the middle, but it was him. I'd know those pale gray eyes anywhere. They were the last thing I saw on that riverbank, the night everything went wrong. He carried his robe like armor, but his face betrayed him. The moment he saw me, he froze. Not long, maybe a heartbeat, but enough. Enough for me to see the ghost climb back into his eyes. He blinked once, straightened his papers, and forced his voice steady. "Be seated." No one else noticed. But I did, because I'd seen that look before, the look of a man who suddenly remembers every sin he buried. I sat slowly, hands on my knees, pretending to listen as the clerk read through the docket. My heart beat so hard I could feel it in my ears. The judge's voice wavered, once barely, like an old transmission losing signal. He looked anywhere but at me, the lawyers, the ceiling, his notes. But when his eyes flicked down again, I caught it, that small tremor in his hand, the one wearing the same gold wedding band I remembered from that night, the one that glinted when he held the flashlight, the one that slipped just before the current took him. The rain started, then soft against the courthouse windows, a steady rhythm. I swear it sounded just like that night, the storm building, the wind pushing the river to rise. I told myself I was imagining it. But when the thunder rolled in the distance, I saw him flinch. Maybe he thought I'd forgotten. Maybe he prayed I had. But I hadn't. The past doesn't drown. It just sinks low enough to stay out of sight until something drags it back up. And as I sat there watching his hand shake against the gavel, I realized something cruel. He wasn't the only one still guilty. If you saw the man who shared your darkest sin wearing the robe to judge you, would you tell the truth or let him live with it? I tried not to stare at him, but the harder I tried, the more my eyes drifted back. The courthouse clock ticked like a hammer each second, striking too loud, too steady. I could almost hear my pulse matching it. Every sound, the creak of benches, the shuffle of papers, felt like it carried weight. Like the whole room was waiting for something unspoken. He cleared his throat once, twice, and finally started the hearing. Case number 4. 7. 2, he said, his voice low and tight. Walker versus Collins. My heart stopped. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard. Walker. I wasn't suing anybody. Then it hit me. It was Tom Collins' land dispute. I was just a witness. But still, hearing my name roll off his tongue like that after 40 years of silence, it shook me more than I'd admit. His voice cracked just slightly on my name, and he tried to hide it by flipping a page. I noticed his hand tremble again. The man had always been good at hiding his nerves, but not that day. Tom turned around and whispered, "You all right, Bob?" I nodded, though my throat felt tight. Yeah, just long morning. But it wasn't the morning wearing me down. It was that look, the one the judge gave me from the bench. He didn't glare. He didn't smile. He just looked the way a man looks when he's watching his own life fall apart piece by piece. The rain picked up outside, tapping harder against the glass. It wasn't loud, but it filled the spaces between words. Every time the room went quiet, you could hear it, a soft, steady rhythm that made the silence feel alive. When it came time for me to speak, I stood. My knees popped and my hand brushed the edge of the wooden pew, the same one I'd sat on as a teenager, waiting for my cousin's sentencing. Same smell. Same creak. My palms were sweating. The bailiff handed me the Bible. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do." But my voice came out hoarse like gravel. As I sat in the witness chair, the judge's eyes flicked to mine for a half second. No words, just that silent exchange, the same kind men share when they know exactly what the other's hiding. I wondered if he remembered the sound of the water that night, or the flashlight slipping from his hand, or the moment we decided not to call for help. Back then it was self-preservation. Now, it felt like cowardice. The attorney asked his questions: where I was that evening, what I saw on the property, what I knew of the fence line. My answers were plain, truthful enough. But under every word was another truth pressing against my chest, begging to be said. And he knew it. I could see it in his clenched jaw, the way his fingers tightened around the gavel. Every time I paused, he looked ready to cut me off, afraid of what might come out if I stopped thinking and started remembering. Then came the question I wasn't ready for. "Mr. Walker," the attorney said, "do you recall the night of August 12th, 1978? There was a boundary incident back then, wasn't there?" My mouth went dry. A murmur passed through the room. I looked up straight at the judge. His eyes went wide. He leaned forward just slightly, his lips parting, as if to say something. Then he stopped himself. The gavel in his hand clicked softly against the wood. "Mr. Walker, the lawyer pressed you were there, weren't you?" The rain stopped. The silence afterward felt unnatural thick. My fingers found my watch, the same old one I'd worn that night. I felt its slow, steady tick beneath my thumb. I took a breath. "Yes," I said quietly. "I was there." The judge's hand froze midair. For the first time in 47 years, the truth had stepped into the light, and it wasn't done with either of us. When I said those 3 words, "I was there," the air in the room changed. You could feel it ripple through the benches like static, though no one else really knew why. The lawyer nodded, scribbled something down, and moved on, but the judge, he just stared at his notes. Not reading, not breathing much either. It's strange how memory works. One minute you're in a courtroom full of strangers. The next you're back at a muddy riverbank under a broken moon. August 12th, 1,978. It had been raining for 3 straight days, the kind of rain that makes the earth smell like iron and oil. I was 23, working nights at a machine shop. Henry Whitmore was 28, fresh out of law school, just starting to build his reputation. We weren't friends exactly, but we shared a secret we didn't mean to. There'd been a fight that night, a stupid one like most fights are. A man named George Pratt, local farmer, drunk and loud, had cornered Henry by the river road. I was nearby fixing a stalled truck when I heard shouting. I ran over just in time to see Henry push back. George slipped in the mud, hit his head on a rock and fell into the river. We both jumped after him, but the current was faster than it looked. We yelled, searched, waited, but George never came up. By the time the sheriff arrived, the storm had washed away every trace of it, except one, a dented flashlight half buried in the mud with Henry's fingerprints all over it. He begged me not to say anything. He said it was an accident, that George had threatened him, that no one would believe the truth. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was scared too. So I helped him bury it. Not the man, the story. And for nearly 50 years, that secret stayed buried. Until this morning. The lawyer asked me another question, something about fence posts and boundaries, but I wasn't hearing him anymore. I was back on that riverbank, soaked to the bone, my heart racing like it wanted out of my chest. The judge finally spoke. "Mr. Walker, please, answer the question." His tone was sharp, but I caught the tremor in it. He wanted control back. Wanted me to pull the memory back under with him. "Yes, Your Honor," I said, forcing the words. "The fence. It runs past the creek." I swallowed hard. He looked at me, and for a split second, it was just the two of us. Again, 2 young men, staring at a body disappearing into dark water. My watch ticked once, twice. I could almost hear the radio that had been playing in my truck that night, static between old country songs, the voice of a preacher talking about forgiveness. I remember how the sound of rain against the windshield made it hard to breathe. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Mr. Walker, are you saying you were familiar with that area before 1978? I hesitated. "Yeah," I said softly. "I knew it pretty well." The judge shifted in his seat. "Counselor," he said, "let's move along. That's not relevant to this case." The lawyer frowned. "With respect, Your Honor, it's directly related to..." "Move along," the judge repeated louder this time. His gavel struck once sharp enough to make a few people flinch. Everyone went quiet. But I saw his eyes, the fear behind them. He wasn't protecting the law. He was protecting himself. I sat there still as stone, while the rain outside started again, harder this time. It drummed on the glass, like fingers on a coffin lid. And I realized something: the past doesn't just haunt you. Sometimes it sits across the room wearing a black robe, praying you'll stay quiet one more day. That was the moment I knew the trial on the docket wasn't the one that really mattered. Ours hadn't even begun. After that exchange, the rest of the morning dragged on like a punishment. Every question felt heavier than it should have been, like there was a second meaning hiding underneath. The lawyers talked about lines and boundaries. On paper they meant fences, but in my head it sounded like something else entirely. The judge kept cutting the questions short, trying to steer things away from anything close to 1,978. I could see him fidgeting, rubbing the edge of his wedding ring, staring at the watermarks on his notes, as if he could crawl inside them and disappear. The bailiff called a short recess around 11. People stretched, chatted, shuffled papers, all normal things. But the minute I stood, I felt his eyes on me again. The judge stayed at the bench longer than he needed to, pretending to organize his files. I waited a beat before heading toward the hallway. Outside the courtroom, the rain had turned steady, whispering against the tall windows. The sound filled the empty corridor like breath. I leaned against the wall, rubbing my temples. My head was pounding, partly from nerves, partly from old guilt, waking up after a long sleep. "Mr. Walker," someone called behind me. I turned. It was him. Henry Whitmore. Without the robe, he looked smaller somehow. Human again. He approached slowly, like a man stepping onto thin ice. "Bob," he said quietly. "Can we talk a moment?" My stomach tightened. "We're talking now." He looked around, made sure no one was near. "Not here," he whispered. "Come with me. Just for a minute." I should have walked away. Every good thing in me said, "Don't follow him." But curiosity, or maybe unfinished business, pulled me in. He led me down the hallway to a small anteroom by the clerk's office. The walls were lined with old portraits, judges from decades past, staring down like ghosts with powdered hair. He closed the door softly behind us. The silence between us was thick. He kept his back turned for a long time. Hands on the window ledge, rain blurring the world outside. Finally he spoke. "You shouldn't have come." I laughed, once bitter. "Didn't have much choice." Subpoena's a funny thing. He turned, then eyes tired, face pale. "You don't understand, Bob. If anyone connects what happened that night," I cut him off. "You mean the night George died? The night we buried the truth before the sheriff got there?" His jaw tightened. "It was an accident." "Yeah," I said. "I remember. You said that then too." He stepped closer, his voice low but shaking. "You swore you'd never tell." "I didn't," I said. "But you're the one who brought me here. Maybe the truth's just tired of waiting." He pressed his palms to his eyes, breathing hard. "You don't know what I've had to live with." I took a step closer. "Don't I?" He looked up, something breaking behind his eyes. "You think I slept a single night? You think I forgot that river I've sentenced men for less than what we did?" The words hit me harder than I expected. He wasn't the same arrogant young man from that night. This was someone hollowed out, eaten by the very justice he'd sworn to uphold. "I've built my life on pretending I deserve that robe," he whispered. "And you showing up today, you're the ghost I never buried." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The rain outside grew louder, drumming against the glass, steady as a heartbeat. Then I said softly, "Maybe ghosts come back, 'cause they're owed the truth." He turned toward the window again. "If you say anything, it'll ruin everything." I hesitated. My watch ticked quietly under my sleeve. "Maybe it should," I said. When I walked out of that room, I didn't know if I was headed toward justice or damnation, but for the first time in 47 years, I wasn't running from either. I walked back into the courtroom, but the air felt different. He stayed behind in that little room for a long while, long enough that folks started whispering, wondering where the judge had gone. I took my seat, kept my eyes down, and tried to slow my breathing. The rain outside kept tapping the glass like a nervous hand. When Henry finally returned, his robe looked heavier somehow. He sat down, adjusted his glasses, and forced his voice to steady. "Court will resume." But it didn't sound like him anymore. It sounded like a man trying to wear a mask that didn't fit. Tom Collins' lawyer stood, cleared his throat, and went back to his questions. I answered what I could, short, simple, safe. Every time I looked up, Henry avoided my gaze. Every time I didn't, I could still feel him watching me. Like we were both waiting for the same thing, the other man to break first. A little after noon, the rain stopped. The sun tried to push through the clouds, casting long, pale beams through the window glass. The light hit the judge's bench, reflecting against the brass plaque with his name on it. I stared at that name, Honorable Henry Whitmore, and thought how thin those letters looked against the weight of what they carried. After the hearing, they called for lunch recess. I walked out, slow and deliberate, needing air. The street smelled like wet concrete and old coffee. I found a diner across from the courthouse and slid into a booth by the window. The waitress recognized me. "Haven't seen you in a while, Bob," she said with a half smile. "Been laying low," I answered. "Court business today." She raised an eyebrow. "You in trouble again?" "Not this time," I said, though I didn't sound convinced. She poured my coffee, strong black, no sugar. The first sip burned just enough to remind me I was still alive. Across the street, through the window, I could see Henry's shadow pass behind the curtains of his office, still pacing, still trying to think his way out of something you can't think your way out of. The radio behind the counter played some old country tune, one I hadn't heard since the 70s. The singer's voice cracked on the word, "Forgive." I almost laughed. Life has a cruel sense of humor. I thought about what he said. If you tell, it'll ruin everything. But what's everything when it's built on a lie? I stirred my coffee slowly, watching the swirl of dark liquid turn in the cup. Funny how guilt looks the same, always moving, never settling. The bell over the diner door rang. I looked up and froze. It was him. Judge Whitmore, no robe now. Just a man in a wrinkled shirt and gray tie. He scanned the room, saw me, and hesitated before walking over. A few folks glanced up from their meals, but no one paid much attention. He stopped by my booth hand, gripping the back of the chair. "Mind if I sit?" I shrugged. "Free country." He sat down, exhaled through his nose like he'd been holding his breath since morning. "We can't talk here long," he said quietly. "But I need to know. What are you planning to do?" I looked at him for a long time before answering. "Planning," I said. "I wasn't planning anything. But it looks like the past is." He rubbed his temples. "Please, Bob. I've got a family. A name. Everything I built on a man's death," I said flatly. He didn't argue. Just stared down at the tabletop, his reflection rippling in a puddle of spilled coffee. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance. I leaned back and said, "You ever wonder if George Pratt's ghost is still walking that riverbank waiting for us to tell the truth?" He didn't look up, but I saw his hands shake. "Every damn night," he whispered. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the tick of the wall clock and the hum of the radio static fading between songs. Then he said, "If this gets out, I lose everything." I stared out the window, watching rain start again in the distance. He looked at me like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing he had nowhere left to step that didn't lead down. We sat there in silence for what felt like an hour, though it couldn't have been more than 5 minutes. Outside, the rain started again, softer. This time steady as breath. The sound filled the spaces between us, better than words could. Henry stirred the cold coffee in his cup without drinking it. "I've replayed that night every day," he said quietly. "Every time I hand down a sentence, I see his face in the water. I see you on the riverbank calling his name." I didn't answer right away. The diner smelled of bacon grease and wet coats, the kind of smell that sticks to your skin long after you leave. I glanced at my reflection in the window. Older, heavier, a man who'd carried too much too long. "Then why didn't you ever say something?" I asked, finally. He swallowed hard. "Because saying it would have meant losing everything I became after it. I thought, maybe, if I kept doing good, it'd balance out what I did wrong." "Does it feel balanced?" I asked. He didn't answer. Just rubbed his forehead, like the truth was a headache he couldn't shake. "You remember what he said that night?" I continued. Before he slipped, he looked up slowly, eyes wet. "Yeah," he said, "you'll regret this more than I will." The rain outside hit harder, streaking the glass. I could almost hear George's voice in the wind, slurred, angry, full of the kind of pain that only comes from betrayal. I keep hearing that line, Henry said, staring out the window. Every time the river floods, every time it rains like this. I hear him. I nodded. Me too. The waitress came by, asked if we needed anything else. We both shook our heads. She left us with a look that said she'd seen too many conversations like this, two old men with ghosts in their cups. After a while, Henry said, "You could have left that night. You didn't owe me anything. Why'd you stay?" I looked down at my hands. They were trembling slightly, the way they used to when I was 23. Trying to start my old truck after the rain shorted the ignition. Because I thought I was doing the right thing, protecting you, protecting the law. And now I think I just didn't want to be alone in the guilt. He nodded slowly, eyes on the table. That makes two of us. The radio shifted to a slow instrumental tune, a guitar hum that sounded like something out of a memory. It played under our silence like a confession neither of us knew how to finish. Finally, he said, "If you tell the truth, I can't stop you. But if you don't, maybe we can find another way. Something that makes it right." I met his eyes. "Right for who, you, me? Or George?" He exhaled, defeated. "Maybe for all of us." I thought about that for a long time. About what it would mean to dig that old secret out into daylight, to speak it aloud, to let it ruin both of us. And then I thought about how heavy it felt carrying it all these years. Sometimes I said the only way to make something right is to stop pretending it ever was. He nodded again, eyes glassy. "I wish I had your courage." I gave a small, humorless laugh. "You think this is courage? Feels more like running out of places to hide." Outside, a flash of lightning lit the street, quick, silent like a camera flash from some unseen photographer recording the moment. He stood slowly, dropped a few bills on the table. "I need time," he said. "Please, don't do anything yet." I didn't stop him. He walked out into the rain without an umbrella, shoulders hunched, the robe of his office long forgotten. I watched until he disappeared into the gray haze. The waitress came by again, refilled my cup without asking. "Storm's not over," she said, glancing out the window. "No," I murmured, watching the courthouse through the rain. "It's just starting. Some storms don't come from the sky, they come from the past, and they don't stop until they've washed everything clean." The storm rolled through the rest of the afternoon, never quite leaving, just changing its mind about how hard to fall. By the time I walked back toward the courthouse, the gutters were running high, and the air smelled like wet iron. I could hear thunder far off, slow, patient, the kind that waits its turn. Inside, the halls were mostly empty. Lunch recess was nearly over, but the crowd hadn't come back yet. My boots left little prints on the marble floor, each one smudged by the next. I paused at the drinking fountain, took a slow sip, then looked up at the framed photographs on the wall, rows of judges and sheriffs. Men who looked carved out of their own certainty. Henry's portrait would join them one day, I thought. Unless I opened my mouth. When I stepped into the courtroom again, he was already seated, robe back on face, composed, too composed. He looked like a man holding a mask that was starting to crack. He avoided my eyes when I walked past the front row. The gavel came down once. Court is back in session. Tom Collins and his lawyer returned to their seats. The opposing counsel, a younger man named Reed, straightened his tie and smiled that slick city smile. I'd seen that kind before, the kind that thinks truth is something you can bend with the right tone of voice. He called me back to the stand. Said he had a few more questions about the old boundary markers near the creek. The same area where George Pratt's farm once bordered the Whitmore property. That name again. George Pratt. It hit me like cold wind. I looked at Henry. He'd gone pale. His hands clenched the gavel so tight. His knuckles turned white. Mr. Walker Reed said, Would you say the creek has shifted its path over the years? I nodded slowly. Yeah, floods'll do that. And those floods, the ones in the late 70s, they caused a dispute, didn't they? I hesitated. The rain outside tapped louder like it was eavesdropping. Yes, I said. They did. Reed tilted his head. Between who? Silence. You could have heard the clock tick. Henry's lips moved slightly, whispering something only I could see. Don't. I cleared my throat. Between George Pratt and the Whitmore family. A faint gasp went through the room. Reed smiled. Interesting. That name's not in any of the documents. How'd you remember it? I was there, I said quietly. I remember more than most. Henry dropped his gavel by accident. It clattered across the bench and hit the floor. The sound echoed off the walls. He froze, then bent to pick it up, hands shaking. When he rose again, his face had gone pale as paper. Reed raised an eyebrow. Everything all right, Your Honor. Henry straightened. Proceed, he said, voice brittle. But Reed wasn't blind. He'd caught the exchange, and like any man chasing blood in the water, he wasn't about to stop. He smiled faintly. Mr. Walker, do you recall anything unusual about the night of August 12th, 1978? I looked down at my hands, the same ones that pulled George's flashlight from the mud. There was a storm, I said. Like this one. And were you with anyone? I looked up right at Henry. He met my gaze for the first time since lunch. His face said one word, louder than his lips ever could. Please. The rain hammered the windows harder now. Thunder rolled again, closer this time. Yeah, I said finally. I wasn't alone. Reed leaned forward. And who was with you? I could feel the weight of every year pressing down. The smell of river water filled my nose. Phantom or memory, I couldn't tell. Then Henry stood. Enough, he said sharply. This line of questioning is irrelevant. The court will disregard. With all due respect, Your Honor, Reed interrupted. You're the one who brought up the property history last hearing. If Mr. Walker's testimony connects, I said enough. Henry's voice cracked, and the gavel struck so hard it echoed like gunfire. The room went dead quiet. Even the rain seemed to pause. I stared at him, chest tight. He'd just shown everyone what I'd known all along. The calm, righteous judge was gone. What stood there now was a man terrified of his own past, and everyone in that courtroom felt it too. You can bury a secret for 50 years, but the moment you start digging around it, the ground remembers. The courtroom stayed frozen after that outburst. No one dared move, not even the stenographer. The echo of that gavel still hung in the air, like smoke after a gunshot. Henry stood behind the bench, breathing through his nose, one hand pressed flat against the wood, as if to steady himself. Reed took a small step back, glancing between us, realizing he'd hit something raw, something deep. Finally, the judge spoke, his voice calmer but hollow. This court will take a 15-minute recess. The bailiff nodded, and everyone stood like they were waking from a spell. The murmur of voices started low at first, then louder confusion, rippling through the crowd. I stayed seated for a second, longer, feeling the blood thump in my ears. My hands trembled slightly. I hadn't meant to say that much, but maybe the truth doesn't need your permission once it starts crawling out. I rose slowly and stepped into the aisle. Henry disappeared through the side door, his chambers. I knew I shouldn't follow. I knew it was better to let the past rot where it lay. But I also knew the look I'd seen in his eyes before he left. That was a man on the edge of breaking. The hallway outside was quiet, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint sound of rain. I found the door marked Judge's Chambers. My hand hesitated on the knob. Then I pushed it open. He was sitting at his desk, the blinds half closed, his robe tossed over the chair behind him. His head was bowed, fingers gripping his temples. He looked like someone waiting for a sentence that never came. When he heard the door, he didn't look up. "I told you not to follow me," he said, voice hoarse. I closed the door gently behind me. "You didn't tell me not to care." He let out a low laugh, bitter, tired. "Care, Bob? I haven't cared about anything real in decades. Every time I bang that gavel, it's just noise, a hollow sound, trying to drown out the river." I walked closer, my boots quiet on the carpet. "Reed's not done. You know that, right? He smelled blood out there. He's going to dig." "I know," Henry said, staring at his trembling hands. "And when he does, it won't just be me. You'll go down too." I nodded. "Maybe it's time." He looked up, eyes red. "You think confession fixes things? It doesn't. It just burns everyone. Standing too close." "Maybe," I said. "But lies burn slower. They last longer." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The ticking of his office clock filled the silence, steady, patient. Outside the window, a siren wailed somewhere in town, fading fast. "You remember what you told me that night?" I asked quietly. He frowned. "Which part? That we'd never speak of it again? That it was an accident, and the truth would only destroy good men?" He nodded, voice low. "And it did." I leaned against the desk, folded my arms. "We were kids, Henry. Scared. But now, we're just old men, still scared of our own reflections." He looked at me, really looked this time. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the storm's been chasing us long enough. Maybe it's time to stop running." He shook his head, stood up abruptly, pacing toward the window. "You think the town will forgive a judge who killed a man and let another take the silence for him? You think my family can survive that?" I took a step forward. "Maybe forgiveness isn't about surviving." He turned, face pale in the half-light. "And what about you, Bob? You think this confession of yours will set you free?" I thought about that, really thought. Then I said no. "But it might let me breathe again." He stared at me, jaw tight, the rainlight from the window catching the tears in his eyes. "You're going to say it, aren't you?" "I don't know yet," I said. "But I'm done pretending I didn't watch a man die." The room went quiet except for the faint patter of rain against the glass. He walked back to his chair and sat heavily, the years catching up to him all at once. Then he whispered, "If you speak, I'll lose everything. If you stay silent, you'll lose yourself." His words hung there like a verdict no one wanted to claim. I looked at the clock. It was ticking toward the end of recess. The moment of choice was coming, whether either of us liked it or not. Somewhere down the hall, the bailiff's voice called court, resuming in 5. Henry didn't move. Neither did I. 2 men. One secret 47 years. And only one of us would walk out of that room, clean. When the bailiff's voice echoed again, "Court is now in session," Henry still hadn't moved. He just sat there, staring at the floor like a man watching his own footprints disappear in the rain. I turned for the door. My hand brushed the cold brass knob before I looked back. "You coming?" He didn't answer. Just nodded once, slow, resigned. When we stepped out into the hallway, the murmur of voices from the courtroom rose and fell like waves. I walked ahead, but I could hear his shoes dragging slightly behind me. By the time we took our seats, every eye was on him. His outburst earlier had left a mark. Even the jury seemed uneasy, whispering behind their papers. Reed stood tall, too pleased with himself. He saw the judge's weakness and smelled victory. "Your Honor," he said, with that lawyer's smile, "I request permission to recall Mr. Walker for one final question." Henry adjusted his glasses, voice barely steady. "Proceed." I stood again. My knees popped. The courtroom felt hotter than before. The kind of heat that doesn't come from the air, but from tension, pressing in from all sides. Reed took a few steps closer. "Mr. Walker," he said earlier, "you mentioned that you were present during a dispute between George Pratt and the Whitmore family. Was Judge Whitmore himself involved?" Every head turned to him. The whole room leaned forward. Henry froze. His hand hovered over the gavel but didn't touch it. I could feel my throat tighten. The clock on the wall ticked once, twice. Outside thunder rumbled far but real. Reed repeated the question slower. "Was Henry Whitmore present that night?" My heartbeat filled my ears. I looked at the judge, at the man who had once been my friend, my accomplice, my ghost. His lips barely moved, but I read them clear as day. "Please don't." And maybe in that moment I saw something in him I hadn't seen before. Not guilt, not pride, but the quiet kind of fear that lives in good men who did one bad thing and never found their way back. "I don't recall," I said. A whisper ran through the room. Reed frowned, unsatisfied. "You don't recall?" "That night was almost 50 years ago," I said evenly. "I remember the storm. I remember the river. Faces come and go." Reed narrowed his eyes. "Convenient memory, Mr. Walker." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe some things fade for a reason." The lawyer opened his mouth again, but Henry finally lifted the gavel. "That's enough," he said firmly. The tremor in his voice was still there, but softer now, almost grateful. "The witness may step down." I nodded, once stepped off the stand, and returned to my seat. The wood creaked under me as I sat, that same tired groan it had made since I first walked in that morning. The rest of the case went on like background noise. Numbers, land plats, property lines, all just words floating in air too thick with history. I heard little of it. My mind was somewhere else, entirely back by that riverbank, with the flashlight beam cutting through the rain and George's voice echoing before the silence swallowed him. The storm outside grew heavier again. Lightning flickered through the high windows, reflecting off the judge's nameplate like a pulse. When the session finally adjourned for the day, the courtroom emptied slowly. People whispering, glancing at us as they passed. Some looked suspicious. Others, just curious. Small towns remember every rumor. I lingered until it was nearly empty. Henry stayed seated, pretending to review his notes. When the last door closed behind the clerk, he set down his pen and spoke without looking up. "You didn't tell them?" "No," I said. "Not today." He looked up at me, then eyes damp. "Why?" "Because it's not my place to judge anymore," I said softly. "It's yours." He nodded once, like a man accepting a sentence. "Then maybe it's time I start doing it right." I turned toward the aisle. The rain against the windows softened to a whisper again. A gentler rhythm now, almost forgiving. As I reached the door, he called out, "Bob, do you ever think God forgives men like us?" I paused, hand on the knob. The room behind me smelled of old wood and dust, the scent of too many confessions left unsaid. I think I said quietly, "He gives us time to learn how to." And then I walked out. Sometimes silence is mercy. But sometimes it's just another way of telling the truth. Slow, and in your own time. By the time I stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The street glistened under a pale afternoon sun, puddles reflecting the courthouse columns like crooked mirrors. I stood there for a while, watching the water slide off the gutters, feeling the cool air hit my face. It should have felt like relief. But guilt doesn't care about weather, it just changes form. I walked to my truck, parked across the street, the same old Ford I'd rebuilt a dozen times. The seat springs squeaked when I sat down. I turned the key, but the engine hesitated, coughing before it caught. Maybe it knew I wasn't ready to leave. The courthouse steps were still visible through the windshield. For a long moment, I just sat there watching people trickle out, lawyers clutching briefcases, clerks rushing through puddles, some jurors lighting cigarettes like they needed to burn away the tension. And then he appeared, Judge Henry Whitmore, no longer hiding behind the robe or the gavel. Just a man in a gray coat, shoulders heavy, eyes lost. He paused under the awning, scanning the street until his gaze landed on me. We didn't wave. We didn't nod. But in that small silence, we both said everything we hadn't dared to in court. He walked down the steps past the flagpole, past the statue of Justice holding her scales, and turned toward the parking lot. His head stayed bowed, as if the weight of all those years had finally settled on him. I should have driven away right then. But something in me said, wait. And sure enough, 5 minutes later he came back. No coat now, no umbrella. Just him carrying a small envelope in his hand. He walked straight across the street toward my truck. He stopped by my door. "Can we talk?" he said. "Seems that's all we've been doing lately." He gave a tired smile. "Maybe this time I'll finish what I started. I killed the engine. Go ahead." He glanced around, then handed me the envelope. Inside there's a letter. My resignation. My confession. And something for you. I frowned. Didn't take it. "I don't need your confession, Henry." "Yes, you do," he said softly. "Because I can't carry it alone anymore." The wind picked up, rustling the papers he held. One corner of the letter caught a beam of sunlight, thin, sharp, like a blade. He went on. "I wrote the truth, every word. About the river. About George. About you. I'll turn it in tomorrow morning. I'll face it." I studied him. "Why now?" He looked out at the horizon where the storm clouds were breaking apart into slow-moving gold. "Because when you looked at me in there, I saw the kind of man I used to be, the one who still believed redemption wasn't just a word." I didn't know what to say. My throat ached with too many things at once: relief, anger, sadness. "You think they'll forgive you?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "Doesn't matter. I'm finally going to tell the truth. That's all I've got left to offer." I reached for the envelope, my hand brushing his. His fingers were cold. Inside, I could feel the weight of the paper, heavier than it should have been. "What's the other thing in here?" I asked. He hesitated, eyes wet. "A photograph. From that night. I kept it all these years. I thought, if I looked at it enough, it'd start to fade." And did it? "No," he said quietly. It got clearer. He stepped back, straightening his shoulders like he'd made peace with the cost. "Whatever you decide to do, Bob, burn it. Keep it. Read it. I'll stand by what's inside." He turned, started walking away toward the courthouse doors again. The light hit him just right, that late afternoon glow that makes everything look softer, like forgiveness itself was painting the world in gold. I watched until he disappeared inside. Then I looked down at the envelope in my hand. My name was written on it, Robert Walker, in the same handwriting from that night's police report. I turned it over once, twice. My watch ticked softly in the cab, and for the first time in years I didn't feel afraid of opening the past. Sometimes the truth doesn't demand revenge or punishment. Sometimes it just waits quiet and patient for the courage to be heard. I didn't open the envelope right away. It sat on the passenger seat, the whole drive home, shifting slightly each time I hit a bump. The sound of paper sliding against the worn vinyl made my stomach twist. It was strange, 47 years of silence, and the truth was sitting right there beside me, quiet as a sleeping animal. The road out of town was slick with leftover rain. The sky had turned the color of pewter, that soft gray that always seems to show up after a storm, when everything feels heavier but cleaner somehow. My wipers kept a slow rhythm, steady as the ticking in my chest. When I reached my driveway, the house looked smaller than I remembered. The paint was peeling, the porch light flickered, same as always. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee grounds and motor oil. I tossed my keys onto the counter and stood there for a while, listening to the old fridge hum like a lazy engine. Finally, I sat down at the kitchen table, the one she and I used to eat breakfast at before she passed. The wood was scratched and uneven, a lifetime of small mistakes carved into it. I laid the envelope in the center. The paper was slightly damp from the rain, edges curling like it wanted to open itself. My hands hovered above it, unsure. I thought about all the things I could do: burn it, read it, tear it to pieces, and scatter it in the yard. But then, I remembered Henry's face when he handed it over. That look, not pleading, not proud, just tired. A man at the end of running. So I opened it. Inside were two things: a letter and a photograph. The letter was typed, neat, official. His resignation. Effective immediately. I, Judge Henry Whitmore, hereby step down from my position at the county court, citing personal misconduct, dating back to the 12th of August 1978. My eyes stopped there. I didn't need to read the rest, not yet. Instead, I picked up the photograph. It was small, worn at the corners. The kind of picture that came from an old disposable camera, grainy, slightly blurred. But I knew that scene. I could never forget it. The river. The flashlight beam cutting across the dark. And in the corner, half hidden by shadow, two men standing ankle-deep in water, faces ghostly in the glare. One was me. The other was him. I set the picture down carefully, as if it might shatter. In that moment, I felt something crack open inside. Not guilt, not even relief, something quieter. The kind of sorrow that comes when you realize time hasn't healed a damn thing. It's just made the wound polite. I finished reading the letter. He confessed everything. The fight, the accident, the silence that followed. But what got me wasn't the admission. It was the last paragraph, written by hand. Bob, I've lived under the shadow of your silence, and I know I never deserved it. But if forgiveness is real, maybe it begins not with words, but with finally letting the truth see daylight. If I don't make it to tomorrow, tell them I tried. H. I read it twice, maybe 3 times. The ink was smudged near his name, like he'd written it through tears. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. The clock on the wall ticked steady. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving only the sound of dripping from the porch gutter. For the first time since that night, I didn't feel like a bystander to someone else's story. I was part of it, and now maybe I could help end it. I folded the letter, slid it back into the envelope, and turned off the kitchen light. The house fell quiet, except for the faint creak of wood and the ticking of my watch. Then from somewhere deep inside that silence, I whispered to no one. Maybe this is how forgiveness starts. Not loud, not clean, just honest. The night settled in, gentle and gray. And though the storm had passed, I could still feel the river moving slow and steady, carrying old secrets toward whatever mercy waited downstream. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that photograph, 2 figures in the water, blurred by motion and guilt. The image pulsed behind my eyelids like a heartbeat. I turned on the radio just to fill the quiet, but all it found was static. Around midnight, the wind shifted. The house creaked the way old wood does when it remembers storms. I got up, made coffee I didn't need, and sat back down at the table with the envelope still in front of me. The letter felt heavier now, like the truth had soaked through the paper. Outside, a dog barked once and then stopped. The world felt paused, like it was waiting for a decision. I thought about Henry. About the way he'd said, if I don't make it to tomorrow. At the time, I'd brushed it off as guilt talking. But now, sitting there in the dark, those words felt sharper. I grabbed my coat and keys. The roads were slick with fog when I drove back toward town. Every streetlight looked like a halo smeared by rain. The courthouse sat silent against the night sky, all its windows dark except one, his. The sight made my stomach twist. I parked by the curb and stepped out. The air smelled like wet earth and paper. As I climbed the courthouse steps, I could hear the low hum of the generator and the distant tick of the clock tower above. The front door was unlocked. That alone set something uneasy in my chest. Inside the building felt hollow, echoing footsteps, faint drip from the ceiling. I followed the thin strip of light spilling from the crack under his office door. My hand trembled on the knob before I turned it. He was there, sitting at his desk coat still on a half-empty glass beside him. The blinds were drawn halfway moonlight, slicing across the room in silver bars. His resignation letter, the copy he planned to file, lay open on the desk, his signature neat and final. "Henry," I said softly. He looked up. His eyes were glassy but alive. "You read it?" "Yeah," I said. "I did." He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "Good. Then it wasn't all for nothing." I stepped closer. "You don't have to do this alone. We can tell it together. Go to the sheriff. In the morning." He shook his head. "No. You already carried my sin once. I won't let you carry the rest." His voice cracked near the end. He looked tired. Not from lack of sleep, but from years of holding his breath. I saw the revolver before he reached for it. It sat half-hidden under a stack of papers. My chest seized. "Henry," I said quietly, "don't." He didn't raise it, just rested his hand over it like a man feeling the weight of a choice. "Bob, there are two kinds of justice. The kind you face in court, and the kind you face when no one's left to judge you but yourself." I took a slow step forward. "You don't need to pay like this." He looked at me, eyes wet, voice trembling. "Maybe this is forgiveness. Maybe this is how I make it right." I shook my head, throat tight. "Forgiveness doesn't ask for blood, Henry." He smiled faintly. "Maybe not. But the truth does." For a moment, everything went still. The rain, the hum of the lights, even the clock on the wall. I stood frozen, every muscle waiting for the sound I prayed wouldn't come. Then finally, he exhaled a long, shaky breath and pushed the gun away. "I can't," he whispered. "Not tonight." Relief hit me so hard I almost couldn't stand. I walked over, placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did the hard part already," I said softly. "You told the truth. Now, let it live." He closed his eyes. "Tomorrow," he murmured. "I'll face it tomorrow." "Tomorrow's enough," I said. I took the gun, unloaded it, and set it out of reach. Then I helped him to his feet. We stood there in silence for a long moment. Two men, too old for tears, but too tired to stop them. Outside, the wind eased. The rain thinned to a drizzle. Somewhere far off, a church bell rang once, marking the hour, a sound that felt less like time passing and more like mercy, arriving late, but still coming. When I left the courthouse that night, dawn was breaking soft and gold. The storm had spent itself, but for the first time in 47 years, I felt like maybe, just maybe, it had washed something clean. The next morning, sunlight poured through the kitchen window like a promise I didn't quite trust. It was the first clear day in a week. The grass still glistened, puddles shining in the gravel like bits of glass. I poured myself coffee and sat at the same table where the envelope had rested the night before. The house felt still too. Still, the kind of stillness that follows a storm, but doesn't mean peace, only waiting. I told myself Henry would turn up at the courthouse, that he'd file the confession, face what came next, maybe even walk out the other side lighter. But a part of me, the old mechanic in my gut, that could tell when an engine was about to die, already knew better. At 8:30 sharp, the phone rang. The sound was sharp in the quiet room. I let it ring twice before answering. Mr. Walker. The voice on the other end belonged to Sheriff Lang. He'd aged like the rest of us. Slower voice, gentler tone. But that morning it carried a weight I recognized. Yeah, Sheriff. You might want to come down to the courthouse. My stomach sank. Is it Henry? He hesitated. Just come. I didn't need more than that. I grabbed my jacket and Key's heart, pounding a rhythm I hadn't felt since the war. The drive back into town felt longer than it should have. The sun had climbed high, turning the wet pavement into mirrors. When I parked, there were already a few squad cars by the steps. A crowd had gathered whispering. Lang met me at the door. His hat was in his hands, eyes red around the edges. He came in early, he said. Before anyone else. My mouth went dry. He filed the letter. Lang nodded slowly. It's on his desk. Signed. Time-stamped. He did it, Bob. And him. Lang looked away for a second, jaw tightening. Heart gave out far as we can tell. Doc says maybe it was stress. Maybe it was just time. But he was gone. Before anyone found him. I closed my eyes, a long breath catching somewhere between grief and understanding. He didn't. No. Lang said softly. Not by his own hand. Looks like he just sat down, wrote what needed writing, and let go. For a moment, the whole world went quiet. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. I followed Lang upstairs to the judge's chambers. The door was open. Sunlight spilling across the desk. Papers were stacked neatly. The revolver sat in the drawer untouched, and there beside the gavel was the envelope addressed to the county board, his confession. I reached out, tracing my finger over the ink of his name. The handwriting was steady, peaceful almost. Lang cleared his throat. He mentioned you in the letter. Said you'd bring it to the right people. Yeah, I said. I will. He nodded, gave my shoulder a squeeze, and left me alone. The clock on the wall ticked soft. Same sound I'd heard the night before. The same rhythm my watch carried everywhere I went. Time, faithful, and cruel. I looked around the room, the bookshelves lined with law journals, the photographs of Henry shaking hands, smiling in black robes. He'd spent his life trying to convince the world he was a man of order, and in the end, maybe he finally found it. I sat in his chair, the leather still warm from his last hour. On the corner of the desk was something small I hadn't noticed before. A folded piece of paper separate from the confession. My name written across it. I opened it carefully. Just one line inside, handwritten, "You were right. Forgiveness doesn't ask for blood, but truth always asks for courage. Thank you for giving me mine." The handwriting trailed off near the bottom, the ink faint. I read it again, then again, until the words blurred. For a long while, I just sat there, sunlight creeping across the floor toward my boots. Eventually I stood, picked up both letters, his to the court and mine, and slipped them inside my jacket. When I walked outside, the air smelled of rain fading into warmth, the way earth smells when it's learning to forgive. The townsfolk stepped aside as I passed. None of them asked what happened. Small towns don't need the details. They just know when something heavy has shifted. At the bottom of the courthouse steps, I stopped and looked up at the flagpole, the breeze, tugging gently at the cloth. For the first time since that night in '78, I didn't feel the river pulling at my heels. Some men die seeking justice. Others find it quietly, by leaving the truth behind them. I drove out to the river that afternoon. The same one that had taken George Pratt all those years ago, swollen now from the week's rain, the current slow but certain. The dirt road leading down was half washed out, and the truck's tires kicked mud against the fenders. It looked almost the same as it had that night in 1978, only quieter. I parked near the old sycamore where we'd left the flashlight. The roots had grown thick over the years, twisting through the soil like veins, trying to hold the earth together. I stepped out, boots sinking into the wet ground. The air smelled of rust and wild mint. For a long moment I just listened to the wind sliding through the grass to the water, folding over itself to the faint ticking of my watch. It all sounded familiar, like a hymn I'd forgotten the words to. I walked closer to the bank and crouched down. The mud there still carried that same slick shine. I imagined the three of us again. Me, Henry, George, younger, foolish, thinking the world could be reasoned with. I spoke out loud, voice rough in the open air. Henry did it, George. He told the truth. The words carried over the water. Soft and strange. I half expected an echo, but the river only murmured back. I don't know if that's enough, I said. But it's more than we had. A bird lifted from the far shore, a heron gray, and slow gliding low across the current. For a second, I thought it looked like forgiveness wearing wings. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out Henry's photograph. The one from that night, two men, half lit by flashlight, forever standing in that same moment between sin and silence. I held it over the river, hesitated, then let go. The paper landed softly, floated for a few seconds before the current caught it. It drifted downstream, turning once, twice, and then vanished under the reflection of the sky. I stood there watching until it was gone. In the distance, I heard thunder again, not a storm, just weather moving on. I smiled a little. Guess you finally got your piece, I whispered. When I turned back toward the truck, the sun had started breaking through the clouds, streaking the fields in gold. I climbed in, sat there for a while, hands resting on the wheel. There was another envelope on the seat, Henry's confession to the board still sealed. I'd promised to deliver it. I planned to. But something in me needed one more moment. Before I did, I opened the glove box. Inside, I found my old radio, the same one that used to hum faint gospel songs during long drives. The dial still worked barely. I turned it on. Static filled the cab first, then faint music broke through, a preacher's voice, old and trembling. The river may carry your sin, but it cannot carry your soul. You must let go yourself. I laughed under my breath. Yeah, I got the message. The sun climbed higher, glinting off the wet hood. I reached into the breast pocket of my coat and took out my watch. The glass face was cracked, the hands frozen at 12:47, the same time George fell into the river all those years ago. It had stopped then, and I'd never fixed it. Maybe I didn't want to. I looked at it one last time, then wound it gently. The second hand twitched once, twice, and started to move again. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was motion, and motion, I'd learned, is the closest thing a man gets to grace in this world. I started the engine. The truck coughed, rattled, then settled into a steady hum. The sound filled the cab, comforting as an old friend's voice. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The river flashed once in the sunlight, a thin silver line curling through the earth, and then disappeared behind the trees. For the first time since that night, I didn't look back. The road stretched ahead, long and quiet, leading somewhere that might not be redemption, but was close enough to start believing in it again. I reached the courthouse just before sunset. The sky was the color of rusted copper clouds, drifting low like tired ghosts. I parked across the street again, same spot as before, and sat for a minute with the engine off. The town had gone quiet. No more crowds, no more whispers. Just that late evening hum, the sound of a place exhaling after holding its breath too long. Henry's envelope lay on the passenger seat edges, soft from handling. His handwriting looked steady, even in the fading light. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands, wondering what would really happen when I turned it in. Maybe headlines, maybe silence, Maybe both. I got out, crossed the street, and climbed those courthouse steps one last time. The doors were locked for the night, but Sheriff Lang had told me where to leave it in the drop box by the clerk's window. I stood there holding it over the slot, and for some reason I couldn't let go right away. That envelope wasn't just paper. It was 47 years of weight of guilt and silence and rain-soaked memory. It was a man's whole truth, folded into something that could fit in one hand. I took a slow breath, looked around at the empty hallway. The same hall where I'd once swept floors as a kid, where I'd first seen Henry in a cheap suit, where I'd come full circle today. The ticking of the wall clock echoed faintly down the corridor. Then I slid the envelope through the slot. It landed with a soft thud, and just like that, the story we'd both carried finally belonged to someone else. I stood there a long time after listening to the silence that followed. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was clean. When I stepped outside, the rain had started again, light, silver, steady. The kind that doesn't chase you off, just keeps you company. I walked down the steps. Slow hat. Low coat collar turned up. The air smelled like wet stone and cedar. Across the street, the diner lights glowed warm in the dusk. I crossed over boots splashing through shallow puddles. The bell above the door jingled softly. Same waitress behind the counter. She looked up, surprised. "Well," she said, "you're back again." "Guess I never really left," I said. She poured me a cup without asking. "You look lighter," she said. "Everything all right?" I stared into the steam rising from the mug. "Not all right," I said quietly. "Just honest." She smiled at that like she understood. Maybe she did. In towns like ours, you don't need to know the story to know the feeling. The radio behind the counter played a slow tune, an old Willie Nelson song I hadn't heard since before the accident. The line that came through clear made me stop mid-sip. "Forgiving you was easy, but forgetting seems to take the longest time." I laughed softly. "You hear that?" I said. She nodded. Funny how songs find you when they're supposed to. We sat in easy silence after that. Outside, the rain painted the windows in soft streaks of gold from the streetlights. I could see the courthouse faintly reflected in the glass. Tall still, but no longer looming. I reached into my coat pocket and took out my watch. It was still ticking. For the first time in decades, it was keeping time again. I set it on the counter, listening to the rhythm between the seconds and the rain. Tap, tick, tap, tick. The sound matched the quiet inside me, steady, forgiving. When I finished my coffee, I stood, left a few bills under the cup, and tipped my hat to the waitress. "Take care of yourself," I said. "You too, Mr. Walker." Outside, the street shimmered under the rain. My truck waited by the curb headlights, catching the mist. I stood for a moment, looking back at the courthouse one last time. Not as a place of judgment anymore, but of closure. Then I got in, started the engine, and drove off into the fading light. The radio crackled, then found a clear station. A preacher's voice. Again. Softer this time. "The truth shall make you free, but first it'll break you apart." I smiled, turned up the volume, and let the rain and road carry me home.